All right. Well, I hope you've been blessed by the music. You've had some time to read and reflect. I've got my handy dandy Bible here. I'm in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, a verse that many people know about. It's a fairly popular one, so let's dig in and then explore how this has to do with our sacred community. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we're all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? And if the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every single one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would a body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are actually indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with a special kind of modesty. While our presentable parts, they don't need that kind of special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division of the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. For you see, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. The truth of this statement can be seen and has been experienced, no doubt, by every single one of us when we stub our toe. How often do we think of our toes in daily life? I mean, somewhat. But for such a small little digit, especially the baby toe, when you do that stumble in the middle of the night or whenever it is and you smack it, I don't care what part of the body you are, everybody feels it. The whole body shuts down when that pinky toe gets hurt. And this is kind of the point that Paul is talking about. Obviously, I'm adding a little bit into it. But we are many parts, and yet you're one. So when I hear this sermon preached, when I reflect upon it myself, the natural sort of inclination is to think about like, oh, okay, this is my part in the body, whatever part I may see myself being. But I want us to dig in a little bit deeper and apply it to this idea of a sacred community. Because never forget, when Paul writes you, Y-O-U, in the Bible, it's never a singular you, it's a collective you. To borrow from our wonderfully inclusive language of our southern neighbors in the United States, it's more of a y'all. Y'all know this, you all. Not me, but all of us as you. And I think that is an incredibly important piece, because if I have one concern about church in the 21st century, and largely in the 20th century as well in North America, one of the things that has crept into our theology is a profound sense of individualism. Does this church meet my individual needs, whatever those needs may be? And they may be completely legitimate. There may be the desire to have a full and robust Sunday school to make sure that our children are getting a good Christian education. That's fair, that's good. Is it close to my house? Do I like the music? Do I like the minister? All these sorts of considerations are taken in place. And in our culture, in this time in the world, people are very comfortable with what we call church shopping. And I think that is an absolutely appropriate term for it. We apply to our spiritual journey the same sort of mentality we apply to clothing, food, entertainment, anything. We're very comfortable shopping. And that has been problematic. Not because, and I don't put this on people, but because the church itself has bought into this. We're always trying to come up with maybe the newest and flashiest and most innovative way to get people in. And that, as any of you know who've heard me speak, is a real problem, and frankly, not a concern of mine. The more important point is, what is it that we're doing? If we're so concerned getting people in, where's the attention put to what do we do once we're actually all together? And to answer this, I want to offer up a very important person in 20th century Christian history. The picture you're looking at right now is a man by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was born in Germany in the early part of the 20th century and is a very notable church pastor, but also a theologian, second to none. Very, very influential, written some very important books that have inspired myself as well as countless others. Now, the important element of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which sadly has some bearing again in our present age, has to do with his opinions about Nazis. Now, as I said, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born and raised in Germany. He was from a wealthy family. He was well educated. He traveled quite a bit. And as things got crazy in his homeland in the 1930s and early into the 1940s under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, Bonhoeffer was actually in New York. He was a professor and was adamantly in opposition, to the Nazi regime, and most specifically because Hitler, in a stroke of political genius, had actually set up a German Christian church. Now, this church was very much in service to the government and was basically tasked with spiritualizing a lot of the Nazi propaganda and the Nazi political beliefs, including the idea that the German people were a special race, being profoundly anti-Semitic, as we all know, as will bear out throughout the history of World War II, but as well as sort of celebrating the German nation, making it great, getting rid of immigration, sort of closing it in. And again, sadly, there's a lot of parallels to the present age that we're living in. And I mean, we may be tempted just to think of America, but it's not the case. It's throughout this sort of circling the wagons and sort of very, very comfortably identifying who is in and who is out. So Bonhoeffer finds himself in New York. And in this sort of powerful turn of events, he agonizes and reflects, and based on his own belief about the church, his own belief as a Christian, he left the safety and the prestige of his position in New York and actually returned to Germany. He returned there, he took on a position, a fairly public position, we'll move past all this sort of stuff, but his ultimate goal was to undermine the Third Reich. And Bonhoeffer was a pacifist. He really believed that to be a Christian meant that you could not be violently opposed to another human being, that was blasphemy, that was idolatry. But as he saw what Hitler was doing, as he saw the struggles of German Christians, those in his church would come to be known, or the church he joined would come to be known as the Confessing Church, those who were trying to maintain true Christianity in opposition to this much more politicized version of Christianity, which was inspired and sustained by the state. He actually took part in an attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler. It was ultimately unsuccessful, and he was arrested as part of that and was actually executed for treason in the very closing days of the war in 1945. So why do I bring him up, and why do I bring him up with this topic? Well, we have some writings from Bonhoeffer that shows his deep and profound struggle because, again, his pacifism led him to believe that any kind of an assassination attempt, even against someone like Hitler, was still ultimately a sin. And at the end of the day, he had to say, I'm not expecting God to forgive me for this, but I can no longer stand by. And as long as this man is in existence, the very soul of my brothers and sisters in this nation is in jeopardy. And so he chose what he believed to be the lesser of two very profound evils. And the reason he did this is rooted in what we call ecclesiology, his beliefs about what the church is. And for Bonhoeffer, the church was a sacred community. That salvation cannot actually be experienced, and in some ways cannot actually be found independent of the church. And therefore, what Hitler was doing to the church was not just ruining a social institution, but was actually jeopardizing the salvation of countless Germans because they were under so much pressure to join, but they were not receiving the community and the sacred teachings that was absolutely essential to their salvation. This is an ecclesiology I subscribe to more than just the idea of getting people into church. This is why numbers have never really appealed to me, because at the heart of this has to be authentic. And again, the criticism I have of the 21st century and the thing that I see us all struggling with is numbers. But what is this family? It is a sacred community. It calls us to reject the individualism of our age and to submit to finding humility in shared relationship with each other. Perhaps people leave because they don't like a fellow parishioner. Bonhoeffer would say, it's exactly that frustrating parishioner that God has placed in your path to work through something in you. And if you remove yourself from that situation, you deny God's grace in your own life. Perhaps you don't like me or the ministry or how the person preaches and whatnot. Bonhoeffer would argue, this is exactly the kind of thing that God is placing in front of you so that you can have the opportunity to grow deeper in your own faith and own connection. But where that differs from individualism, like, okay, well, this is all about me, is that actually who you are is discovered and found and strengthened and grown in that sacred community. And that sacred community must, above all other things, be protected and adhered to and guided. We can talk, we can discuss, we can go through all these different ideas about should we do this, should we not do this. We can fight with each other, we can disagree with each other. We can even downright not like each other. But to you, I respond just as Paul did when he talked about the body. If you are an eye, you don't get to say to the ear, you're not a part of this. And if you're a hand, you don't get to say, oh, because I'm not this, I'm leaving. Paul says, no, don't you understand? All these many parts form but one body. And if ever there was a time to focus on the unity of who we are, in all the varieties of ways that we show it, whether we're Pentecostal or Baptist or Catholic or Orthodox or whatever, we are all still of the same Spirit, baptized in the same Spirit, following the same God. And this is a message that must not just be talked about, but demonstrated. Remember, the earliest communities were full of Jews and Greeks, people that did not get along, especially when you have Greeks or Gentiles, or, they don't necessarily from Greece, but Gentiles following after a Jewish Messiah and figuring out what that means. We have slaves and their masters. We have men and women all gathering together. Again, people that society at that time said do not interact. Or if they do interact, clearly one is superior to the other. But in the body of Christ, they are not. Because those who are afforded less honor are actually in the body of Christ treated with greater reverence. The parts that we don't expose to the public are given modesty. The baby toe is protected because when it gets hurt, we all hurt. And you're kidding yourselves if you don't think that was a very compelling demonstration for the people at that time. They would look at these groups and be like, what? They don't make any sense. To which Paul would respond, this is the body of Christ. This is not just what we do. This is who we are. Our divisions, the things that make us different, this is God's creation. And his grace is manifested in the fact that we worship next to each other and with each other, because ultimately that shows that who we are, despite our income, despite the color of our skin, despite our gender, despite anything else, is children of God. A God who creates in diversity and binds together through grace, forgiveness, and love. Dietrich Bonhoeffer could not stand for one moment longer Hitler ruining the sacred community, destroying the body in the name of a fascist, Nazi, socialist, evil regime as history has revealed it to be. And he said, I would rather rot in hell than allow this man to have control over this message any longer, because the church is the thing. We will lose something in this culture when we lose a church, and we will lose something incredibly, incredibly valuable. But that's a concern I can share for those who do not attend church. This message is for those of us who do. The sacred community is just that. It is sacred. It is above and beyond our ability to tamper and tinker with. That's when we're doing it right. It is something that we submit to because it is sacred. We recognize its central importance because it is sacred. It removes us just from our own concerns, our own desires, our own wishes, and puts us into community because it is sacred. And because it is sacred, it is a vehicle of grace, and it means that you are being saved, that your salvation is working out in this crazy, weird, sometimes boring community that says words at the same time, that sings songs that some people know and others people don't, and makes coffee and has silly shows and hangs out in garages talking about chickens and beer. All that stuff is sacred. And while God may call us onto other communities, for which I'm always fine, as long as somebody is finding a sacred community, I do want to hold up not how we do church, not saying this is the way you should do it, but recognize that when you join a community, you are joining a family. And even more so than that, you are joining a sacred family that God has called you to, and God has placed all those other weirdos in it with, so that you can grow and you can grow them. That's the Spirit. That's the body. That's our sacred community. And that's why we need to keep doing this week in and week out. And when we can gather together to continue doing this, because there's brothers and sisters out there that won't make it to these buildings, but we are going to reach out to them, not because I have specially important words, not because the way Mountsburg and Westover does it is better than anybody else. No, that's not the point. Because maybe, and for this season, God has invited you, God has attached you to this sacred community. And for me personally, I take that very seriously. And I welcome you. And I hope that you see that, distant as you may be, didn't mean for that to rhyme, God has brought you here for a purpose and is growing you and is speaking to you. And brothers and sisters, when God says your name and when God talks to you, that's because God is saving you. You are sacred because you're in a sacred community. I miss you. I can't wait to see you. But you have no idea how much it comforts me. And I hope comforts you to know that we remain connected. And even something as profound as a global pandemic cannot and will not sever the ties that form our sacred community.